I made a video some weeks ago about the death of the UK High Street, just asking what had happened to our towns, our town centres, when it comes to retail and shopping. And I saw a news story this morning which I thought was relevant to that discussion, and that was the announcement that WHSmith has been sold off and will now be called TG News. And there's an uproar online about this name change. Now, WHSmith as a retailer has been struggling on the high street, but not when it comes to its travel division, which makes up about 80% of their revenue. So the company has been sold off for £76 million, which means that its new owner, a company called Modelo, will now own 500 high street stores, which will change names to TG News moving forward. That leaves WHSmith with 1,200 stores worldwide, not in the UK. And what I hadn't realised when I read that news story was that WHSmith has been in operation for 230 years. That's wild. It's been such a pivotal retailer on the high street, selling newspapers, magazines, at one point video games, board games, and everything else that as a child you might have loved. That's where my fond memories of the retailer comes from. So I'm sad to see it go, but I'm not surprised. I've worked for technology companies over the last 20 years, and I've done a little bit of business with WHSmith, and they weren't a particularly easy retailer to work with. Now, when you work in sales and you're selling to a buyer, there's always going to be challenges in the relationship. But some retailers I've worked with have been super collaborative, understood that this was a joint venture and came into it as such. Other retailers, however, tend to have an air or a grace about them, that they feel that they're more pinnacle in the high street, let's say. To give you some examples of that, WHSmith would be one of them. Boots, the chemist, would be another. And lastly, a well-known retailer who has also been struggling recently, John Lewis. Very challenging to work with, always seen from a higher perspective than the brands that they work with. Makes it very challenging when you're negotiating. So, to say that I'm surprised about WHSmith, no. But my early memories of them was actually more with John Menzies, if you remember them. Well, WHSmith bought John Menzies in 1998. But John Menzies was one of the first jobs I ever had. I delivered newspapers for them for a little while, very short period of time in my youth. But it was such a great store to go to in your childhood. That was where I bought my first ever video games from. I had a Spectrum Plus 2, and the war with a Spectrum was against the Commodore, right? When I went to school, you either had a Commodore or you had a Spectrum, and that was the first ever games rivalry. I had a Spectrum Plus 2 that had the cassette deck built in the side of it, and I would go to John Menzies on a Saturday, and I would go into the games section and I would stand there looking at all of the cassettes that would be available, all the early video games. And you would get something like Operation Wolf, if you remember that, which was like a army first-person shooter style game in a fixed position, panning left to right. And you would play that on the Spectrum. It would take an hour to load. Remember that noise? And you would play the games, but they would be $9.99. It was a lot of pocket money to get, so that was like a treat. It wouldn't be every weekend. Some weekends I would just go in and look at them. Remember, you would just go in and browse. But that was in John Menzies. And then, as I say, in 1998, John Menzies was taken over by WHSmith. And they have been everywhere on the high street. And then in later years, expanding into the travel sector. So when you go into an airport or a train station, you will still see the WHSmith name WHSmith are retaining ownership of the name. So they're only selling off those other stores to Modelo on behalf of TG News. 76 million doesn't seem like a lot to me for 500 stores, but it is a declining business, so it's hardly surprising. But just a sad reflection of our high streets these days, where major retailers over the last number of years through COVID and before that have struggled to understand the shopping habits of consumers and have been left behind. When you think of some of the greats that we've lost, comparable to WHSmith for me would be Woolworths, where you would go for your pick and mix or your 7-inch singles on a Saturday. And when it came to WHSmith, John Menzies, apart from the video games, it would be going in there for your magazines. When I was a kid, comic books. When I got a little bit older, Panini sticker albums, especially when the World Cup came round, right? I've still got a couple of them. Actually found them in my dad's house. Not surprisingly, my father had collected and kept my completed Panini books. But yeah, you would go into John Menzies, WHSmith, and you would get your packet of Panini stickers, try and complete your album, look for the foil stickers that were like the superstar and the World Cup team. God, I've gone on a tangent here about nostalgia moments, right? This is a Saturday video. But yeah, we've lost Woolworths, we've lost C&A, we've lost Debenhams. Some of these massive organisations that have fallen foul over the last years. Which retailer are you missing? Is there any from that list that you think, yeah, that was a real loss to the high street? Let me know down in the comments. But for now, we'll see the end of the great WHSmith, unless you're travelling. In which case, 30 countries around the world, including North America, has a WHSmith with inside it. Still owned by the original retailer, and will continue on that 230-year retailer tradition. That number honestly just blows my mind. I hadn't realised how long that had been in operation, but sad to see. I read that in some of the retail news over the last couple of days, particularly with having subscriptions to some of these news alerts from working in sales. But there you go, that's today's update on what's going on in retail high street. What about you? Where have you gone shopping these days? Where do you buy your products from? Online? Or are you still making the efforts to get out and shop with your favourite stores? You can let me know down in the comments. Thanks for joining me this morning. It's a lovely blue skied morning. Have a great day, and I'll see you on tomorrow's video.